I'm Meredith Preston-McGhie, the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, and I'm very pleased today that I'm joined by Rose LeMay, the CEO of the Indigenous Reconciliation Group. Rose, welcome.
Thank you, Meredith. It's great to be with you.
I hope that you and yours are all safe and well in this difficult time, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Everybody's doing well, but it certainly is a different way of living. I think we're all learning how to cope with this.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the reason for the Pluralism in the Pandemic portal, which the Centre has just recently launched. What we're looking at in the portal, of course, is an online curated set of writing, interviews such as this one, and other content to really start thinking about how we understand what's happening to all of us in the pandemic in terms of issues of exclusion, marginalization, inclusion, pluralism, and hopefully positive responses as well. I'd really like to dive in. We've got lots of questions and would really like to hear your thoughts on the situation. You recently wrote a piece in the Hill Times, which many of us found really compelling, on the argument for race-based data within the pandemic. And within that, I think you were speaking specifically about the need to be shining a light on issues of inequality and marginalization in this difficult time. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why we need this data, why we need it now, and what that will mean for us in the future.
Sure. I did actually write this article because I was struck by two different pieces of news that came out quite recently. And one was a provincial health leader said that we don't need race-based data in terms of COVID-19. And on the same day, another provincial health leader said that they will not release which community or even which region that COVID-19 cases were in. And I was thinking, I think we're missing something significant. Now, COVID-19, we all know, is going to have an impact, is currently having more of an impact on racial minorities in the States, most likely are going to be here too. It's funny, we don't, in Canada, even have the data, nor do we talk very much around that service industry, for example, tends to have a higher proportion of minorities, higher proportion of new immigrants, and they will be impacted. We've seen that in the Cargill plants, both in the East and the West already. And these service industries, the people have been asked to work at a much higher proportion than perhaps other Canadians, simply because of the jobs that they have. And so COVID-19 will have a racial impact. It'll have different racial impacts on different groups. My fear is that the country is so overwhelmed with sense of emergency, and it is emergency. There's nothing to argue about that. But if we don't have the data now, we will not have the information on which to act to change. My data is the whole platform to try and learn more to do better. And if we don't have this data around COVID-19, it will be a complete missed opportunity.
You mentioned also in the article, and for me this was a particularly powerful point, that it's difficult to see for people who aren't living it, but it is the lived experience of so many people in Canada. And I think, as you know, we want to see where we can have these difficult conversations, maybe as potentially a positive result of the pandemic. And so I was wondering, even though we don't have this data, can you say a few things about how Indigenous communities are experiencing the pandemic? What is happening right now in Indigenous communities?
I think it probably is different for Indigenous communities all across the country. And so we always have to talk about the differences between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Mm-hmm. For First Nations who are living on reserve, which is now less than half of the whole population, it really depends on the relationship that they might have with the province, because most of the COVID-19 response has been provincial and territorial led, which makes a lot of sense. Canada's health act is that we are provincial and territorial. For example, in British Columbia, First Nations are very much involved and have a voice, and there is more known around what is happening for First Nations. The first case that was in a First Nations community in Vancouver Island was almost immediately discussed by the provincial health authority, Dr. Bonnie Henry, and she mentioned what a potential loss it might be. There is a really good relationship there. However, we have no idea what it might be like in other parts of the province, other parts of the country. La Loche and Saskatchewan, it appears to be a hotbed right now. La Loche is both a First Nations and a Métis community. It appears, and I could be wrong, something may have happened in the last couple of days, that the federal government provides healthcare services and support on reserve, and at times provinces may also provide some support, but that jurisdictional crossover doesn't tend to work very well. It's what we would call a matrix, and in any kind of system where there is matrix and crossover, there's room for error, there's room for people falling through the cracks. So in the Loche, I don't know what is happening. It's not clear to me who is taking the lead to support this community. It seems there is a number of cases. We don't even know how many cases. And this is just the gap. And I'm struck by, if I can just share this one story, I was doing a panel recently, and there tends to be this analogy about being in a storm. And this is an emergency, yes, so we also can call it a storm. And it tends to be used as this phrase to make us feel better, but it is a bit of a myth. We're all in this storm together. Well, yes, we're all in the storm together, but we're not all in the same boat. Some people are in the equivalent of a cruise ship and with their families and self-isolating and perhaps strengthening relationships with their kids and have the income in order to ride this out. Some First Nations communities may not even have a boat. We're not in the storm in the same boat. And it's hard to describe until one is actually in these communities to see that there hasn't been a doctor there for a month. There may not be a doctor who comes in if you get sick. The nursing clinic may or may not have the capacity in which to call for help. There may or may not be a plane to get you out. There's just so many more barriers involved in remote Indigenous communities in this country, and it's really hard to describe until you're in one.
Absolutely. And a theme through just everything you've said just now really for me feels like information that we need to know, and it's not just that we need to be able to measure, but we need to have the information, and then we need to act on that information. And in your example of the BC government's response, do you have thoughts particularly on why it's working better in BC, and is there something there that others could be doing? That's one. I have another question to follow up on information, but maybe first if you could just talk a bit about why you feel like the BC government is engaging in a more responsible way.
There are probably a number of reasons. Two come to mind. One, BC is led by an amazing doctor who has worked at the WHO, has worked at different levels, was involved with the SARS crisis in Toronto. So she brings a unique mix of skills and experience and compassion to the job that I think a lot of us might look at and, wow, I wish we had that all across the country. Skills and expertise are always different. The other piece, though, is in BC. BC has signed on the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and BC is committed to implementing that declaration into law. Now, that's the fact, but what has that actually meant is that over the past number of years, the relationship between First Nations and all levels of the provincial government have been immensely strengthened. And it's only with relationship that information is shared and heard and understood. It's the relationship that really matters.
So that actually leads me, I think, really nicely to my other question, to take you back to the original point about why the data matters and why we need to have this information. How do you feel we can be collecting information that is also then turned into practice? How can we concurrently be gathering the right information? I'm conscious often that partial information can be as troubling as no information in many senses. How do we collect responsibly, and then how do we build those relationships to use the information well?
Those are both fairly big questions in this country. Canada has a history of attempting to do race-based data collection in health. Our history is probably about 20 years we've attempted to do this. And so there's a lot of complexity in it because there's so many different jurisdictions. So if BC has the good relationship and has built up its data collection that includes First Nations as a data identifier, that data identifier, and this is where my knowledge around data and data sets is a bit fuzzy, how they identify it might not be exactly in the same way as Alberta, so how do you roll it all up?
Mm-hmm.
But there is actually an important piece in here that we haven't been able to address in Canada yet, and it's simply that some Indigenous peoples, if they can, might actually hide that they are Indigenous. Mm. And so this has been a bit of a block for a lot of jurisdictions and perhaps for Indigenous individuals to self-identify. In Canada, we run on a self-identification system. It is unethical to do it any other way. But what that means is that, well, let me tell you, my good friend who's First Nations from the Prairies, she can tell stories of when she goes for healthcare services and she shows her provincial healthcare card and she receives services like she expects. She might pass for Caucasian, she is First Nations. When she shows her status card, because she is status First Nations, she can see the tone and delivery of healthcare decrease instantly through either a conscious or unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. So people who might be able to hide it might actually not want to self-identify as Indigenous in Canada's healthcare system. If we want to do race-based data, we actually have to start disciplining racism like a fireball fence.
Mm-hmm. And it has to be at the core of who we are as a society, not just in terms of what we collect as information.
For sure. Perhaps it would be us turning a corner as a country that we care about enough to count it. Mm-hmm. My worry is that we don't care yet.
And maybe their trust isn't there also for us to take the leap on the side of the government and for people to feel like they can, as you say, identify in a way that's safe. I'm struck there was some conversations about South Korea in the news over the last couple of days, and people in the LGBTQ community there not wanting to admit that they had been at the nightclubs where there'd been a COVID outbreak because of the stigma around their identities in the country. And so the complex mix really of our social fabric along with this pandemic is really stark. I wonder if you could maybe just reflect a bit on what you feel like some of these big lessons are. We've been talking a lot at the center about how we can build back better at the end of this. That if we are going through what we're going through in each of our communities and globally right now, how can we come out of this with something better than when we went in? So what would be your core lessons, particularly for people who can really act on these things and take some different decisions to make things better in the future?
Well, that is a difficult question. And I think like many Canadians, there are days in which the lessons that come to mind, I'm hoping that we're not going to learn, mm-hmm. depending on how bad the day is. When we first started into this emergency back in early March, mid-March, I was thinking, wow, this might be a time when we actually come together as a society. Mm-hmm. COVID-19 is colorblind. Wow, we're all going to come together. We're going to support each other. And that lasted for a good 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And then COVID-19 seems to be almost like applying this weight to the existing weaknesses in our society. Mm-hmm. Just this pressure. So the lesson is for me at this point, one of my lessons is that nothing comes easily around building societies. And one has to choose sometimes to take the harder road. It may not be natural. In Canada, it hasn't been natural to think about having the self-identifiers for LGBTQ or for Indigenous peoples, even though that is a core part of their being. Mm-hmm. In Canada, we've talked about patient-centered care for a good 2 decades with a complete ignorance around how race and culture and sexuality plays a part in it. I think this is our time to actually learn patient-centered means race, culture, sexuality. Patient-centered means I, as the patient, I get to decide, not the nurse or doctor, what is best for me at what timing. Mm-hmm. That will be pretty challenging for healthcare writ large. I think their pushback will be around, oh, we can't do that in emergency, but if not now, when? The other lesson that I hope comes out of, I was talking with an elder in Northern Ontario who was quite calm about all of this. And there's something about these remote communities that perhaps that two-edged sword, perhaps COVID-19 won't come in, and so his community hadn't been touched yet. Yet the risk, if it comes in, it's going to burn through the community like a wildfire. And he was quite calm, and he started to talk around, you know, this is our opportunity to come back to who we really are as humans, which is not actually capitalism, it's not economic, it's actually social. And so if we can, if we learn anything, I hope that as a Canadian society we come back to what is truly important is our social beings, our relationship, our finding what is core to who we are, that probably is not necessarily as much as around work as we thought it was.
Mm-hmm. And does this pause perhaps give us an opportunity to talk to people who we might not normally have known or understood or talked to in our own societies? I mean, is there maybe more that we could all be doing around reaching out a hand to people that we don't normally connect with across the country?
I think so. On one hand, we could talk about COVID-19 as blurring away all the differences. And perhaps this is our time to learn from different ways that people cope and find meaning under pressure. And I only speak for myself, but I go to elders for that. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that perhaps other Canadians who are not of Indigenous descent may actually really benefit from that perspective as well.
I think we could all use that wisdom right now. I've been reflecting a lot also on our relationship, our response in Canada, and thinking about a lot of other places around the world where I think our response in Canada certainly hasn't been perfect, but there's some real challenges going on globally as well. And someone asked me the other day who's inspiring in the current crisis, and for me it wasn't governments, it was very much communities. And we're really hoping that this portal and these sorts of discussions will enable us to connect with other community leaders and colleagues around the world. And so I was wondering if there were any particular thoughts or messages that you had as we think about this from the global perspective, just before we close.
That's a great question. I'm thinking about New Zealand's experience in managing this crisis. And my network includes some Maori in New Zealand and their response and how much information has been shared by them. But I also can see New Zealand being influenced, of course, by Maori, and not simply because Maori are the clients and patients within their overall healthcare system, but because New Zealand considers itself almost to be Maori. My point being is that the information has flowed from the New Zealand federal government has been, from my perspective, so culturally competent and so inclusive. I would love that Canada could learn more about that and learn more about how to do that in a way that people feel like they belong.
And it sounds like that's an equitable approach, that you're approaching it on a platform of equity and mutual respect, not just as government and the people. For sure,
for sure. The New Zealand Prime Minister has certainly shown an ability to do that, both intentionally and on the fly and every day, and she's an inspiration.
I noticed that the leaders that you're calling out as being really positive in the midst of the crisis are all women, which I will not say that, of course, women have been doing better in the pandemic, but it is striking to see the number of women who've really shown themselves in this.
I think so. That's a great lesson that I hope we also take forward. Women lead really well in crisis.
Yeah,
we're more likely and able to see the impact on family and community and others around us. And wow, do we have a lot of role models right now.
We certainly do. That's a really nice positive note to end on, Rose. And I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us for the interview and to continue the amazing work that you do with the Indigenous Reconciliation Group. So we're really grateful to have you here today. And if anyone is interested in this interview and others, on the portal, if you click on the link at the bottom of the video, you'll be able to access other material on the portal. Rose, thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Meredith, and to your staff and organization. Really appreciate this.
Thanks.